You must love podcasts if you're listening to this. Do you want to start your own one or you already have one? Then follow Smarter Podcasting to get expert advice from me, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. Since 2019, we've worked with over 40 podcasters, produced over 700 episodes, and helped many podcasts get to the top of the Apple Podcast charts. And right now, I'm offering you a professional edit for just $27. Click the link in the show notes.
When you try to speak to everyone, you actually speak to no one. So it's hard to measure what's inside people's brains. But just by having a podcast and publishing content like these social media clips every now and then, just consistently, it gets in people's brain that, okay, that's your specialist subject and you guys really are experts in it. And podcasting should be seen as just one marketing strategy, but different things you do within that strategy.
Welcome to another episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, your host, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. I started my first podcast in 2019 just as a hobby, and I learned so much I developed it into a full-time business, which is 7 Million Bikes Podcast, which produces this podcast. And we've now worked on over 60 podcasts, produced over 1,000 episodes, and helped with millions of downloads, and even helped some podcasts get to the top of the charts. So I started this podcast, Smarter Podcasting, to share with you my tips, tricks, my failures, everything I've learned to help you make the best podcast possible. Now, if you have started a podcast, you probably know that it takes a lot of time and it can be really frustrating. So 7 Million Bikes Podcast is here to help you with that. And if you want to work together, then get in touch with me. Go to 7millionbikes.com, book a free discovery call, and I can chat through with you exactly how we can help you make the best podcast possible, especially for your business, which brings us to today's episode. So in today's episode, I'm really excited to talk to my guest because we're going to share with you why businesses and brands need to be podcasting. No matter what your business is, no matter how big or small it is, I firmly believe like every business now has a website. Eventually, every business is going to have a podcast. So don't be the last one to have one. Be an early adopter and reap the benefits now, and do it before it becomes even more expensive to make a podcast. So if you want help with that, obviously get in touch. I'm really excited to talk to my guest because we recently spoke about the importance of networking on LinkedIn with Joelle Zarilla. If you haven't seen that episode, go back and find that because there's so many good tips in there. And that is exactly how my guest and I met. We had a good chat about two things that we love, which is podcasting and football. He is a freelance podcast producer based in Manchester who specializes in sport and travel podcasts, two of the things that are closest to my heart. And we won't hold it against him, but he is a former producer for Manchester United's podcast, which is actually really, really cool, despite the football team. He's also freelanced for The Athletic, Platform Media, and Give Me Sports Market Madness. And he is the co-founder of Ant Podcast. And just like me, he bloody loves a podcast. My guest today is Nick Thomson. Nick, thank you so much for coming on Smarter Podcasting.
Hello, thanks for having me. That was a great introduction.
Thank you. So tell me about your latest project that combines all of my favorite things: football, food, and traveling.
Good. Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. So who's your football team? Who do you support?
Well, so I'm a Glasgow Rangers fan by birth, but a Liverpool fan by choice.
Oh, okay. All right, fine. No, I mean, so you're right. I used to work at Manchester United, but I'm not actually a Manchester United fan. It was just a job, and it was a good job. I enjoyed it. So I'm a Sheffield Wednesday fan, so I'm not used to any success. But this project I've been doing, yeah, it's been so much fun. It's called Around the World in 90 Minutes. And yeah, what you said really, I thought I want to create something which is 100% like it's my work. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm doing it. My executive producer is my wife, Amy, who's also a podcast producer. And she's making sure that it doesn't get too football and geeky and nerdy. But yeah, my passions, football, travel, culture, food. And I've put that all together in this series. So working at Manchester United, although it was fantastic, it did make me, and it's easy to do this when you work at a massive commercial giant of a football club. You can easily lose sight of what's really important in football. You know, is it about winning? Is it about trophies? Is it about money, sponsorship deals, Instagram followers? What's it really about? And of course, it's no surprise. It's about the people. It's about the fans. It's about communities, bringing people together, whether the team wins, loses, or whatever. And I wanted to fall back in love with football. So I've visited some special and unique football teams around Europe. If there's more budget in Series 2, we can go further. But for now, it's Europe. But by visiting these special teams, which most people would never even have not even heard of, but they've got really interesting stories, I'm hoping to fall back in love with football. And I'm hoping that my listeners who come on this journey with me can do the same thing.
That sounds incredible. I've been really excited because something different. And we both know that the more you niche on a podcast, and we won't get into that today, but the more you niche, the better. And I love a podcast that has a very specific niche like that. So good luck. I'm going to be looking forward to that.
Thank you.
But today we're going to talk about why businesses should have a podcast. And as I said in my intro, and I've been saying this a lot lately, I feel that every business needs a podcast. And even yesterday, I was talking to somebody who worked with an architect and engineering firm, who also happened to be Scottish, went to the same university as me, also supports Rangers, and was born in the West End of Glasgow, which is the same as me. So that was very random. But anyway, I digress. He was kind of like, well, why would an architect, an engineer firm have a podcast? And he said, I don't want to say this, so I won't share his name or who he works for, but he's like, architects and engineers don't really know how to talk to people. And I was saying to him, one of our most successful podcasts was about accounting. We've done podcasts about knitting and arts and craft. Everybody has a niche and everybody has an audience. But why do you think that or am I right? Does every business need a podcast? Like what I said in the beginning, that it's going to be like a website. You remember 10, 15 years ago, some businesses didn't have a website. Now it's almost unfathomable to have a business without a website.
Exactly. Same for social media. I'm sure lots of businesses thought, why do we need a Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter? But most, if not all, now do. And actually, the first point I'm going to make relates to that. So a lot of businesses, brands, they're always a problem they all have is content, like digital content. What can we keep publishing out there into the world on our social media channels or on our website to remind people that we exist? And podcasts are perfect content engines for businesses. So when people think, like your architect example, when people think, why would I, what can I talk about? Who's going to listen? Yes, you have the podcast itself. And if people listen to that, great, amazing. We'll talk about like numbers a bit later and why they don't matter too much. If people listen to the episode, great. But what you can do with that one episode you've recorded, you could do several things. You could transcribe that whole conversation, and then you've got several different like blog articles for your website or text for email newsletters that you could send out. They can keep you going for months to, just to make sure you keep getting back in front of people. But a 1 hour conversation, you could easily clip, you could have 5, 6, 7, 8 1 minute clips, best bits of that conversation. And that is your social media content for the month. And even if, a client might just see this 1 minute video on social media, they now know that company exists. And if even better, if they then get in touch with that company and they become a client, really the podcast has done its job, whether they listen to the full episode or not. Do you see what I mean?
I was talking with somebody recently. The example we were talking about was like, so say you're a plumber and you live in, I don't know, Hastings. I don't even know where Hastings is. I'm just trying to think of a small area, right? Or they live near your town and they have a podcast about their plumbing mishaps or giving plumbing tips, and they only have 50 downloads a week. They have 20 downloads a week, but you're doing that every week. You're putting out social media content. You're putting out blogs. And one day someone's like, I need to get a plumber and I live in this neighborhood. And you Google plumbers in Hastings.
Yeah.
The chances are that person's going to come up. And so it's trying to get through to businesses. I think when we say, oh, you need a podcast, obviously we're saying that because that's our job and that's what we want. And we benefit if somebody produces a podcast. But in terms of marketing, I think it is one of the most valuable things that you can do. And it's helping businesses see the value in that.
Yeah. And it's like human psychology. It's when you're watching or listening to a podcast, especially if you're listening to a real, genuine conversation between two people who care about what they're talking about, you can't help but form some sort of bond with that. And it's really, people do often say they feel a deep connection to their favorite podcasters. They feel like they're their friend. They're in this group sort of thing. It's an intimate relationship. And, you compare that to scrolling through on social media and you see a picture and maybe you look at it for a second or two, you might like it, you might comment, maybe not, but then you keep scrolling and it's gone. So that 2 seconds, you've interacted with it, it's gone, forgotten about, you've moved on to the next picture on social media. But if you've got someone's attention for like 20, 30, 40 minutes a week, that's really, really powerful. Even if the number of listeners isn't so huge, it's way more important, I would say, to have 100 people that listen to your podcast who genuinely like what you're doing and could become customers versus having 100,000 followers on Instagram who are people who don't really care what it is you do that much. They might like it occasionally and they'll never become customers. What would you rather have?
Yeah, for sure. And I was talking with this just yesterday to somebody, because in the last episode, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch it or listen to it. In the last episode, I really dived deep on download numbers and my download numbers, because I just found out my original podcast is in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide, which I'm laughing because it's absolutely crazy. Like, I can't believe it. I knew we were in the top 10%, which was already crazy. And then I went back to look on it and it was in the top 5%. And I know the reasons why that is. And I was explaining to somebody yesterday. So when I looked at the numbers, if you get more than 28 listeners in the first 7 days, you're in the top 50% of podcasts worldwide.
Yeah. And I think that shows you, one, how many there are out there, but two, how many rubbish podcasts there are out there who are made by people who think, oh yeah, I can do this. I've never made one before, but I know what I'm doing. And there's a lot of them out there. So that's why if you just pay that bit extra to go with a professional who knows what they're doing, your podcast automatically will stand out.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And what I was saying was, if you imagine so I actually was telling this to somebody that is a current client, and I went to one of the networking events, and there was about, I would say maybe 15, 20 people at the networking event. And I said, your podcast getting about 50 downloads a week. I said, imagine if you had 50 people come to one of these events every week. And he's like, that would be amazing. I was like, that's the power of podcasting.
Yeah, exactly. Virtually, those people are coming to your event every week.
And they're listening to it intently. And like you said, taking on so much. Yeah. So if you're a business and you're thinking about starting a podcast, what should you do?
You should be. You should be speaking to an expert to help you create that podcast. But even before that, just getting together as a team and thinking, okay, who do we want to speak to first? So think about the audience first, because then you can think, well, what type of content are we going to create? Because there are businesses out there who may think, oh, but what we do is not very interesting or sexy. How can we? You mentioned accounting, right? Sounds very boring, but but it can be made interesting. But once you know who you want to be talking to, you can then think, okay, so what do we want to say? And often you get branded podcasts. So it could be a podcast. Let's say, for example, I don't know. Okay, Red Bull. Okay, I know they get involved in lots of extreme sports, so that is an interesting, quote, sexy topic. But you can get a podcast where it's, speaking to extreme athletes about amazing stories, things they've done, but the podcast is just brought to you by Red Bull. The point I'm trying to make is, and actually maybe a better example to help make my point is, okay, that betting companies, okay, whether you agree with betting or not. I mean, I'm not a betting man, but I know some people are. You get a lot of sports podcasts where they're talking about sport because that's related to betting. They're not talking about betting in the podcast. It's just a football podcast brought to you by X betting company. Do you see what I mean? So that's how companies can still tie their name to a podcast, even if they might be thinking, well, what can we talk about? It's not that interesting. You can talk about something really interesting, but it's just brought to you by so-and-so. So yeah, thinking about your audience first, but maybe there are, and especially when you speak to a podcast expert, someone who with more of a creative mind, maybe there are ways you can make your business sound more interesting, or talk about a topic which is related to your business, which is a bit more interesting. So like the accounting example again, you said something will be boring would be spreadsheets, but something that's interesting is money and having more of it. So there you go straight away. But I would also think about try to be fun. I try to have some fun and be creative with the name as well of your podcast, because names can really help something stand out. I've produced podcasts before where people have actually said to me, and this is how I first started in podcasting. Me and my wife Amy, yep, she's also a podcast producer. I mentioned before, we made a podcast in 2015 called "What the Pho" or "What the Pha," as you'll tell me it's correctly pronounced because you're in Vietnam. But it was a travel podcast, and people have told us, "Oh, I listen because I like the name, What the Pho. It sounds like what the F," Then people like that. It's just playful. A quick example I'll give you is I was once at a business networking event, and I spoke to a couple of men who were talking about podcasting, and they said, but how could we have a podcast? What our company does is we're like a private waste disposal company. So straight away I thought, well, trash talking or talking trash could be the name of the podcast. And we didn't continue the conversation, but straight away you can come up with a fun name which relates to their business and it will stand out.
It's actually quite funny you're bringing this topic up because we've just put out an episode that will be out by the time anyone's listening to this on a Vietnam podcast, which is my other podcast. And we've started a segment recently called Underrated, Overrated, Properly Rated. And we just did an episode based on pho. And one of the things we talked about is how you pronounce it and how it really annoys us as expats who live here, because we know everything apart from how to speak Vietnamese, but we know how to say pho. And so the jokes, even what you said there about how it sounds like a swear word and things like that, all of that came into it. So if you want to know more about pho and whether we think it's underrated, overrated, or properly rated, go to avietnampodcast.com and you can find out that one. But that's a great one as well. That, yeah, choosing the name is just so important as well. So for a business that's thinking of starting a podcast, what are some of the barriers that stop them doing it, and how do we as podcast producers overcome them? I wanted to share with you about one of my favorite affiliate partners, and that is Fiverr. I've been using Fiverr for years for everything from ordering YouTube thumbnails to keyword research, writing podcast articles, even to Canva designs and thumbnails and more. So whether you're a budding entrepreneur, a podcaster, or anyone in between, Fiverr has got you covered. It really is the go-to platform if you want to find freelancers offering a massive range of services to help you on any project. Maybe you need a stunning new logo or just a short animation. Whatever you need, you can find it on Fiverr. What I love the most is how easy Fiverr makes it to connect with talented freelancers from around the world, all at prices that will fit whatever your budget is. Plus, with Fiverr's secure payment system, you can trust that your transactions are safe and secure. No dodgy people you meet on Facebook groups that disappear with your money and never give you what you want. What, that's only happened to me? As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you use the link and at no extra cost to you. As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you click my link and you buy something, all at no extra cost to you. And best of all, you will be directly supporting the making of this podcast that you're listening to for free, but it is not free to make. So why wait? Head over to somewhere that you've probably never been before. It's called the show notes. So whatever app you're listening in, if it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anything at all, head to the show notes, click on my special link, and then you can browse thousands of gigs ready to help you with your next project.
Yeah, well, barriers standing in the way for companies before they speak to a podcast producer is thinking, how do we do it? Don't know anything about podcasting, but obviously that's where you speak to an expert. And I want to reiterate this point because some companies do think, let's just do it ourselves, but they wouldn't do that with a website. They wouldn't do that with, everything their company's about, really. Like if they're a professional, if they're a proper professional business, they do everything else, the proper way with whatever the service or their product is. I'm sure they're qualified to provide that service or sell that product or whatever. Is that something that's common in your part of the world, in the UK? Because I know here in Vietnam, it's a common thing where businesses will be like, we'll just do it in-house. And I've heard this from several people. And as an example of this, I used to work for an English language center, and I was a manager of the charity department. And our project was to build a school in the Mekong Delta, which is a poor,
privileged area of Vietnam. We were going to raise $70,000. And I had a meeting with one of the managers, directors. And she was like, well, we build schools. We have a school building department. Can we not just build it ourselves? And I was like, we build schools in the city, the English language schools. We don't go down to the Mekong Delta and build a school where you need, government relationships, contacts, all that kind of stuff. And so, I mean, thankfully she listened to me, and we worked with a partner who knew what they were doing, and we did build the school in the end. But I've seen it happen so many times. And I told you the story actually before we were recording, where I met with a business who's similar. They do digital marketing. They build websites for people. They do that stuff because they're good at it. They said they were interested in a podcast. And then when I met with them, they were like, well, we're going to do it in-house. We'll bring in our marketing director. He's got a microphone. He'll be able to do it. And then he came in and told me the meager pieces of equipment he had. He had no experience editing, but he was going to do it himself. And you're just shaking your head going, would you, if somebody approached you and said, we're thinking of making a website, can we have a meeting? And then you finish that meeting by saying, but we're going to use Wix and we're just going to do it ourselves. So it's all good.
Yeah, exactly. And I think some companies are guilty of this when it comes to social media, especially smaller companies, which you can understand if they can't afford to hire a social media specialist. But I've seen from previous jobs I've had, normally the job of social media expert just goes to the youngest person at the company, just by default, even if they don't really know what they're doing. But again, I get it for smaller businesses who can't afford it, which again, this is another barrier you asked about, barriers getting into podcasting. Could be the cost for some companies, particularly smaller companies. But once you get to like medium-sized, large companies, it's a drop in the ocean, to be honest. And podcasting should be seen as just one of your many different like marketing, one marketing strategy. But the different things you do within that strategy, there are going to be several. And we're not saying podcasting alone, that's all you need. Definitely not. But it should be one of them.
I think that's exactly what it is. And do we as podcasters need to get better with our messaging?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, and the answer is probably doing what we're doing now. Because I think a lot of businesses, maybe another barrier, they might think, what's the point? No one's going to listen. We're never going to be Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO. That always seems to be the one that people go to.
Always.
Yeah. It's the one podcast that everyone seems to know about. Maybe that and Joe Rogan.
Do you know how many times I've worked with a client and they said, we'd love our introductions to look like Stephen Bartlett, like Diary of a CEO. And I'll be like, he spends about $50,000 per episode. I know your budget is way less than that. So like, I will do the best I can.
Yeah.
And I will make it look really good. But just please be aware that he has a team of I think the last time I saw, he has a team of like 9 or 12 or 20, dedicated to just those clips. So
yeah, those trailers, I wouldn't be surprised if those trailers take long. They must take longer than the actual whole episode to edit. They must do. And, you look at films in the cinema, like trailers, that's a huge industry making trailers. That's massive. It takes a team of people. Yeah. So you're right. He's got a team of people doing that. When customers say, we want to do it, we want to spend 1% of the budget, but we want the same product, please. But budget can be an issue, or companies might think, but what about the numbers? We're never going to be chart toppers. And I'll say, particularly if what your business does is quite niche. Yes, let's get that out of your head straight away. You're never going to be top of the chart, but you don't need to be for it to be successful. What you need is, like we said earlier, just a few people who are the right people listening to your podcast versus trying to speak to everyone. And this is another good point, really. Like the more you niche, the better. When you try to speak to everyone, you actually speak to no one. So I'll give you a good example. If you're scrolling through Apple Podcasts or Spotify and you're looking for the next new thing, and you see a podcast and the title is Chats with Dave, you're like, okay, who's Dave? And what are they chatting about? It's so vague. No one's going to care. No one's going to listen to that. But if it's something very specific, if Dave is a surgeon specializing in, I don't know, brain surgery. Is that even really a thing? Brain surgery? Brain transplants? But, if it's very niche and specific, it's like, okay, like that interests me. I'm into that. A lot of people won't be. Yeah, you're going to push a lot of people away, but the ones you're going to bring in are going to really care what you're talking about.
The Everything and Anything podcast has always been a bugbear of mine. I had a good friend a few years ago, and bless her heart, she was like, "I'm going to do a podcast, but we're just going to do it about everything and anything." And I was like, don't do it. And I said the same thing. If you do it about everything and anything, it's about nothing. And I think we've done episodes or we've done blog posts about it. If you go to Apple or Spotify and you type in everything and anything, you will see hundreds, if not thousands, of podcasts, all with the same name.
Yeah. Wow.
All with the same premise. And yeah, they're not, maybe 1% will do well, but I don't know. Every podcast I can think of that's been successful, whether it's independent or not, has a niche. And I think of the one I can think to hand is Sounds Like a Cult. Do you know this podcast?
Yeah. Or maybe I'm thinking of a very British cult. It sounds like a cult. That's what it's called.
That's it's called. It's American, and it was two women who were one of these lockdown podcasts, but that made it. It got to the top 1%. It's got millions of downloads. And I had a very specific niche. One of them was a comedian, one of them was an author about cults, and they review really random things like Apple, for example, and then they kind of analyze it in a funny way. And they go, "It sounds like a cult. Is it a cult like Starbucks or things like that?" So it's funny and they're entertaining, and it's got a niche, right? It's not just like, "Hey, we're just two people who are funny. Come and listen to our podcast." So I think this is what businesses do need to realize. But what I want to ask you is a really important question, because it's something that comes back a lot, I think, and I think it's really difficult to answer. So I'm actually really interested to hear what you have to say. When a business says, "What's the ROI on a podcast?" How do you answer that?
Yeah. It's often, I mean, there are things you can measure and there are things that you can't measure. The big one really is just like, it's brand awareness, getting the name out there, but also it's perception. So it's hard to measure what's inside people's brains, but just by having a podcast and publishing content like these social media clips every now and then, just consistently, it gets in people's brain that, okay, that's your specialist subject and you guys really are experts in it because you talk about it often. Like, well, you have your own podcast. I mean, most won't even listen to it, but by just having the podcast, you're kind of an authority figure on it. And it backs up that that's your specialist subject, and it does get the name out there more so when you combine it with traditional marketing techniques. So first of all, it's just brand awareness. But yeah, we can't then go out into the street and just randomly ask people, "Do you know about this company?" Because how do we measure that? But brand awareness definitely is the first thing. Then yes, you can look at the numbers. You could look how many people are listening. Where are they listening? Okay, great. This many people now know who we are compared to before we had the podcast. We had no listeners at all. But there's many, many, many different things you can do with a podcast. So yeah, like I said, it's your content engine. It's providing you with content which you could pay to create some social media content, whether it be influencers or actors or whatever, or pay for a TV or internet commercial, like a trade. We're talking about trailers earlier. Trailers aren't cheap, so you get that content out of it as well. Some people who are, it does depend on what you do as a business, but some people then use podcasting to promote stuff that they're selling, whether that be merchandise or their services. So I've worked with people before who are like life coaches, say for example, or a guy who gave advice to people about investing, like in property. And as long as enough people every now and then are through the podcast are clicking his link and signing up to his services, he's like, yeah, I know I'm never going to make money on the podcast, through advertising or whatever. Like, he doesn't get the numbers to warrant selling ad space. So he's very aware that the podcast may never actually generate an income directly, but it's all those other things where it's generating income. Are a certain percentage of listeners converting into clients? It's brilliant. That's what he wants. He doesn't really want, the few pennies you make on ad space to a podcast. So are people converting into clients? Are people buying merchandise? Are people attending events because they've heard about it on the podcast? But again, I go back to that. It's that a brand awareness and just giving you that platform, and people think, well, yeah, you're an expert in what you speak about. You have a podcast. That's impressive. But actually, there's one more, which people don't really think about, and this is genius. A client of mine did this. I didn't really get it at first, but now I do. He had a podcast. I won't name the name of him or his company, but he created a podcast, and he even said to me, I don't care if anyone listens. He says, I use the podcast to approach other businesses that he wants to do business with. And here, some key members of staff, some senior people, he'll ask, I've got my podcast. We talk about, it's in the financial industry. We talk about being a financial advisor. Your expertise will be brilliant. And then people are complimented by that. Like, oh, you want to speak to me? Okay, great. So then they have an hour conversation like we're doing now, podcast chat. By the end of it, you can't help but feel like you formed a bond when you speak to someone for an hour. You now feel like you're best friends. And then at the end of the call, and I can hear him do this because I'm the editor, I can hear the audio, he's still recording. He'll then say, oh, that was great. Thanks for that. Good interview. So what does your business do for XYZ? And they're like, well, actually, we use this company and we're not very happy with them. Boom. Like he's in there. It doesn't happen every time, but he used it as a way to network, and it worked. His business grew. He got more clients himself just by having a podcast and interviewing people who had influence at other businesses. So you compare that with a cold email or a phone call, how often you're going to get a sale that way. But by first inviting someone on your podcast, form that relationship, you got a better chance of doing business with that person.
I got a massive smile on my face because it always feels reaffirming to hear what you say and then hear what someone else say what you say as well, because this is all the stuff that we tell to people as well. And this feels right now so meta, because what we're talking about is what I'm exactly doing with Smarter Podcasting. I'm getting to network with you. I'm getting to talk to you. We're building a relationship. Hopefully the person that's listening to this right now wants to make a podcast. They're hearing me or you as an expert, and they're going to reach out to us and be, hey, we want to work with you. And I've done the same as well. And 100% on your point, and I use this as a case study. So one of my first clients, I still create podcasts with them. I've been working with them for years. They actually only have, I think the last time I spoke to them, about 6 businesses that they can work with, because they work quite high end. And so they don't have like a massive customer pool or anything like that. They just have 6 businesses that repeat business, but they got to keep in their faces. And so when they came to me to start the podcast, it was 100% the exact same thing that you said. They didn't care about charts. They didn't care about downloads, and they still don't. They only do it to be able to send it in an email to their existing customers, to have a reason to email them, because otherwise, like you said, a cold email means nothing. And that first season we did together, they sent it out to their 6 customers, and one of them got back to them right away and was like, hey, we haven't heard from you guys in ages. This is a good reminder. Thanks for this. It was really good information. Let's have a meeting. And they signed a deal with them. And honestly, I don't know. It could be worth hundreds of thousands or millions. I don't actually know, but it's that kind of level of I know that's the level they're operating on. I don't know exactly what one it is, but it's one of those. And we're still making a podcast together. And that just affirms everything to me.
Yeah, through that business deal, the podcast, that they've paid for your services many, many times over, I'm sure. I don't know your prices, but I'm sure. And this is it when you're dealing with, when you're a business who makes high-end sales, you just need to sign like 1 or 2 new clients a year, and then that's it. You're good. And you've also, as a business, you got to think, all businesses do this in marketing. How much money are you willing to spend to get that business? And you kind of do a calculation in your head. So if the contract is worth £100,000, we'd happily spend 10 grand or 20 grand, to get that 100,000, so this is nothing new. It's a new way of doing things in podcasting, but businesses have always done this through marketing. Yeah.
Now I'm the same as you. I love a podcast. I've been into podcasts since they started. That's how old I am. So when Ricky Gervais and Carl Pilkington, Stephen Merchant, I used to listen to them on the way to university. Then obviously got into Serial 2014, and then it's just boomed from then. And that's why I do what I do. I love podcasting. I love the medium. But I said this to Harry Morton when I talked to him. Do you feel like a dirty sellout that we're now using this medium that we love to market? Because there's a part of me that's like, I love podcasting as a medium. And then even now we're talking about, we make this stuff, but we don't actually care if people listen because we know it can help a business market themselves. But is that just what happens? There's very few people that can actually make a living out of just doing what they love.
Yeah, I know what you mean. When podcasting first started, it was, in my mind, I'm thinking, finally, a creative platform, whether you're creating the content or listening to it, a creative platform that it's not about the money, and you can do it on a shoestring budget in your bedroom, and things have changed and evolved. But I think that the magic is still there. If we're, creating podcasts for people, entrepreneurs, businesses, and it's genuinely helping them get more business, brilliant. I think that's a job well done all round. But then I keep the flame alive for me by doing like my own project, like I spoke about earlier, Around the World in 90 Minutes. Like, I'm not making any money on that. Far from. It's cost me money, but it's been great fun for me to do it. I've met a lot of amazing people who listen to the show. The numbers aren't huge, but the people that do listen really love it. It resonates with them, and I get nice messages from people. And I mean, the only selfish part of me doing it is it's an opportunity for me to put my best work out there so that someone might listen one day. Who knows? Someone from the BBC might listen and think, what you did then is brilliant. We've got a similar project in mind and you'd be the right guy. That day may never come, and I'm fine with that. But that's why I'm doing it. And I'm doing it for the love of podcasting. And you're always I listen to a combination of podcasts which are just for pure enjoyment, or there might be podcasts that are a bit more branded. And yes, they are trying to sell to me, but the content is still entertaining. So I don't care. I'm happy to listen to a few ads if it means I can listen to some good content.
Perfect. Well, make sure you check out Nick's podcast, Around the World in 90 Minutes. Nick, thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it. If you do want help creating your own podcast, if you've listened to this and you're thinking, right, I got to get started, you should do it now. Do it sooner rather than later. So get in touch with me. Go to 7millionbikes.com. You can book a call. And if you do enjoy this podcast, don't forget, subscribe, turn on notifications, all that amazing stuff. You can rate, review, and the best thing you can do is share it with someone else who's interested in starting a podcast or already has one, and they just want to make the best podcast possible. So Nick, thank you so much. It has been amazing to chat with you, and a Sheffield Wednesday fan. I think you might be the first ever Sheffield Wednesday fan I've ever interviewed.
There's loads out there.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sal Jeffries. I run the Mindset, Mood and Movement podcasts. I've been working with Neil at 7 Million Bikes for the whole of this year, literally from the start of my podcast to date. And I want to say a couple of things. So when we record the podcast, sometimes there are things that I need tweaking. There could be edits or clips. It's really simple. I give those instructions to Neil, he gets it sorted. There's sometimes a sound level differences between the guest mic and mine. Again, that's all sorted so the outcome is a really balanced sound. And also if there are issues with voice, little kind of sound interruptions, all those things that can distract a listener, Neil knows exactly what to do, cleans it up. The end result, a highly professional, beautiful sounding podcast without distraction. That's exactly what I want. I know my listeners do. So if you're interested in having that level of podcast and that kind of quality, Neil is a great guy and I highly recommend you speak to him.